Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the final part of this set of submarines shows. And they've been very, very popular, so I can definitely return to the subject in the future. But anyway, often overlooked in our collective understanding of submarine warfare are the British operations in the Indian Ocean. It's a fascinating example of how submarines can be used offensively. And to talk about this is Iain Ballantyne, author, editor, and historian, whose book Deadly Trade is linked, of course, in the description below. I'm delighted to welcome back. So, good evening, Iain. How are you today?
Good evening. I'm fine. Thanks very much for having me on.
So, I think you'd agree with me there is that if we're talking about submarines in World War II, obviously the most popular subject is U-boats. Probably then American submarines in the Pacific, maybe Mediterranean, British there, but the British in the Indian Ocean, it's got to be kind of near the bottom of the list of people's interests. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it seems to be an offshoot that doesn't arouse huge fascination, not these days, but it was actually one of the most demanding and difficult arenas for people who had served in the Royal Navy Submarine Service in the Mediterranean to actually switch to. And they faced a whole different set of challenges in pursuing a war at the end, of a long conflict against the Japanese and the Germans and Italians, actually.
Yeah, and you've come on with a PowerPoint that I'm in charge of. And I think one of the recurring themes in these conversations I've had with historians about submarines is it's all very well having submarines. Knowing what to do with them was often the biggest sort of decision for these nations to make, and the Germans started off with good systems and then basically just didn't adapt and didn't improve their systems and failed to adapt to the British and allied anti-submarine operations. Americans, got better and better offensively use them, and towards the end we're kind of almost running out of targets. But the British in the Indian Ocean is where we're going to go today. So let's start with a map. People like to talk with a map to explain things well, because when we're talking about the Pacific or the Indian, obviously we've got to get across the immense distances involved. We always said it. Alex Churchill talked about Taro a couple of weeks ago. The distance is incredible. But also with the Pacific, it was the fact that the Allies divided it up, or that part of the world they divide up. So to kind of introduce this subject of British operations, how did the map get divided, and when did these decisions get made?
Right, I'm just calling up the map myself because I need to get a closer look at it, because this is actually a map I commissioned for the Deadly Trade. The way it happened was that the Americans obviously had their own war against Japan. The war they were most interested in out there was the drive through the Central Pacific, and obviously MacArthur going around through the Philippines, etc. And so it was quite obvious that they wanted to take care of the Pacific, the huge, as you say, the huge, vast arena of war that was the Pacific, and the drive for the Japanese home island. So we're talking about the US Navy led by Admiral Nimitz. And so it was also natural that Britain, which was struggling to kick out the Japanese from 1942 through to 44, obviously from Burma, and with India threatened, was interested in submarines supporting that fight. So when it was clear that the upper hand was being gained by the British in Burma, British and Allies in Burma, and also the Americans in the Pacific, then of course thoughts turned in 1943, I would say, to how do we use the submarines that are now operating quite widely in the Pacific alongside the British submarine force, which was mainly absent apart from 3 Triton-class submarines in the Indian Ocean from, let's say, mid-1942 until the end of 1943. And then the Royal Navy decided it could, having won the war in the Mediterranean, release submarines from there to go into the Indian Ocean. So the American and British naval bosses decided they would divide up the Indian Ocean and the Pacific between themselves. And what happened was basically the British submarine ops, as the map shows, were in the Indian Ocean proper, around the East Indies, and with the British submarine base being at Ceylon and Trincomalee. And the Americans were operating out of Fremantle at that time, and of course they also operated out of Pearl Harbor and elsewhere. And they had some of the Indian Ocean, but they were most interested in what they call beyond the island barrier, which was the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the Pacific. So it was just kind of natural that the British and the Americans had divided up that way. But it was also because of the kind of submarines that they had as well.
So let's talk about the submarines they had, because at first glance, it seems that moving from the Mediterranean to this location is like moving from the tiniest kind of five-a-side pitch to Wembley Stadium in terms of the enormity of the battlefield in this case. So you've got to have. We talked about it with James Scott when we talked about American submarines. You've got to have range. You've got to have the ability to go huge distances, even though as the war progresses, the Allies are pushing the Japanese further and further back, and they're moving their logistics closer and closer to Japan. You're still talking massive distances. So, let's go through some of the slides. So let's talk about the types of sub that the British had out in that area first.
Okay, that submarine you see there's two submarines there. That's a Triton class submarine, and I put some of the details in the slides because I thought rather than just go through all the stats for people and risk boring them a little bit with that, then I just put it there for people to look at. So the Triton class submarine started entering service properly in 1942, and as I said, there were three of them in the Indian Ocean, and then a lot more, and also S-class submarines started to be sent out to Ceylon. So the stats are there. This was, I would say, the most successful submarine, the British submarine of World War II, although the S-class were pretty good as well. And the newer models were the ones that they decided they were most interested in sending to the Indian Ocean. And those were ones which they were able to give a measure of air conditioning to, and also improve their ability to store fresh food. And through using some of the ballast tanks for lubricating oil and other things, they were able to extend their range as well. So these were the newer S-class boats and Triton-class boats, and that's what I think Tactician is one of those. That's what you've got there, because there were different batches of submarines. But they'd already proven themselves in the Mediterranean as being pretty good types of submarines.
Thank you. And we'll go through some of these photos later on. So and it's interesting that some of the photos you supplied, they're kind of post-war. Does that suggest that there wasn't really much recording of this at the time? Is it was considered, less important than other things elsewhere? Was there just not people there taking photos?
They were there. It's just when I put together the slides, I go for the ones I can use copyright free, and I know.
Yeah, of course.
So I used that Australia one, which is an Australian image, and it's very recent after World War II, so they haven't modified the submarine. But in general, they were photographed. It's just that I thought that was quite an interesting photo that is not seen very often. But when it comes to the British and American zones, so I'll just explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so with the Royal Navy, you had the British zone was to the west of the Sunda Strait, and that stretched up into the Bay of Bengal. And the Americans got the more target-rich zone to the east, and that was the Pacific. So the Americans also got the Gulf of Thailand and the Java Sea, and the British, however, took care of the Malacca Strait. So the thing about the Americans was they wanted to pursue a deep ocean campaign, while the British were used in the littorals. And that reflects what you said a second ago about the Americans having the large submarines with endurance, with all the mod cons that could go fast and use different tactics to attack Japanese convoys, such as they were. The Japanese convoys weren't the same order as those you saw in the Atlantic, but the Japanese did have convoys. So the Americans were interested in destroying the convoys from the East Indies to the Japanese home islands with oil and also with raw materials they needed for their war effort. And so those big, fast submarines, as you suggested, were used in that particular way. The British submarines were smaller, and they could go into shallower water. So an American submarine would like to have 180 feet of water to dive in, at least, so they could avoid depth charging and hide from the enemy or make a dived attack with torpedoes. Whereas the British, being smaller, with a shorter periscope, could actually submerge in 60 feet of water, which was unbelievable for the Americans. And so it was sensible with those two types of submarines to have the British submarine work in the littorals, the waters, the shallow waters off the East Indies on their side, and go in after what was left really by then, which were small craft. I mean, there were no battleships or carriers operated by Japan by that time in the Indian Ocean. And so, you know, the targets were smaller, they were closer inshore, and there were some big targets that the British went after. But of course, we can look at those in a moment. But I mean, that basically dictated quite a common sense approach to dividing up the zones.
And did the British come to this plan with their experience in the Mediterranean? It seems pointless to have earned all that, their wings out there, though that's a bad analogy to use when we talk about submarines, earned their fins, and then not use that experience when they get to this theatre. So, you know, as we know there, but as the war goes on, the dynamics between the Americans, the British, the Commonwealth, the Australians, it's changing all the time because of the role each nation is playing, and lesser partners become more important partners, and so on and so forth. But you know, it's not like this is the British are involved in a secondary partners here. This is a combined offensive. It's to bring the war to the Japanese and attack from multiple different directions and in multiple ways. So it's you know, although we don't talk as much about the British ops in this area, they are as important in a different way. Is that am I on the right kind of line?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but by the time, right? I mean, with the Royal Navy, it's the same with the US Navy today. The Royal Navy in World War II had to look at the world, you know, from the beginning. So they couldn't just concentrate their forces in the home waters, or let's say in terms of the German Navy could focus, apart from obviously U-boats, which ranged far and wide, could focus on its main battle fleet being in European waters. The Japanese could focus on having their main effort against the Americans in the Pacific with their battle fleet, you know, to the east of that island barrier. And the British were confronted right from the start with the knowledge that one day, sooner or later, and we're talking about 1939, the Japanese would come for British colonies and European colonies, the Dutch East Indies in particular, and they would come for them, and Indochina. So they had their submarine force, like they had the rest of the Navy, spread across the world. So at the beginning of the war, there were, let's say, I think there were 13 British submarines working out of Hong Kong, and they knew that they would have to keep an eye on the Japanese for that day. However, when the European war erupted, and Britain was not yet fighting Japan, those 13 submarines were withdrawn to European waters, and they then saw action in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. But you know, there were quite heavy casualties among the British submarine service in the Mediterranean. So it was a kind of contraction to deal with, in terms of the British submarine force, to deal with the Germans and the Italians in the Mediterranean and Northern European waters. And then once the German issue had been settled, we're talking late 1943, early 1944, when the German Navy, basically apart from the U-boat force, was not something that was going to be too much of a problem, apart from the odd battleship lurking in the Norwegian fjord. And the Italians surrendered in September 1943, and then the submarines could be released with those very, very experienced crews. And you're quite right, they won their dolphins, although submariners did get the dolphins that they wear today until 1970. Well, let's just call them their dolphins. They got their gold dolphins in combat against the Italians, and also during the Germans off Norway, etc. And so with the Axis threat in Europe declining, that's when submarine depot ships, and they're very important submarine depot ships in the story, could be sent back to the Indian Ocean, and were based at Ceylon, in Ceylon at Trincomalee. And then later, which is something we will talk about, depot ships were sent to Fremantle to work with the Americans, and also to the Philippines. So Britain then had the resources to release, in increasing numbers, submarines back to the Indian Ocean. And in the end, we had about 44 boats working with the Americans and also in the Indian Ocean.
Brilliant stuff. And the support element is really fascinating, because as we've been talking about in this series, again, I kind of reiterate what I said earlier, is it's all very well having submarines. It's using them effectively. It's having the support for them. It's having the use of them, and the use of radar, the use of spotting planes, whatever it would be. If you don't go into the theatre with all that there, all you've got is these hard to deploy weapons that are under the sea. You've got to have that combined arms approach. So, you've talked about the whole history of submarine warfare in your book, and the links are below, of course, folks. What were there any particular lessons that you think the British had learned in the Mediterranean that they brought to this theatre? And what would make the difference between the British approach to submarines and perhaps the German or the Italian?
I don't think that. I mean, in the Mediterranean, there is different kinds of war. I think, for example, in the Mediterranean, it was idiosyncratic, really, because that was one of the few areas where the Royal Navy submarine force was actually pursuing a war against trade, like the U-boats did against, and it was shipping. So I suppose they learned a lot from that in the Mediterranean, which they wouldn't have necessarily got those skills if they'd just been working around Britain, where the enemy merchant ships were thin on the ground, except maybe off Norway. So you had a school of submarine captains and junior officers who became submarine captains, who saw action in the Mediterranean, sinking Italian and German surface vessels, merchant ships, to support the various campaigns to liberate North Africa, and then to invade Italy, and then the south of France, etc. So those guys would have learned how to run their vessels in very demanding hot temperatures, and also in shallow waters that could be shallow, that were easy to see into. And that's an important thing when it comes to submarine surviving, is not being seen from the air and in clear waters. So the skills they could bring out to the Indian Ocean, I mean, they were battle hardened by then. They were certainly more battle hardened than the Japanese submarine force, which was ruled with a kind of rod of iron, and not allowed to stray too far from supporting the army, and also were forbidden from attacking certain targets. So it's a different kind of story, and I won't get into that here. But the point I'm trying to make is the Mediterranean and other actions had bred a certain independent spirit, a flexibility of mind, and aggression, and an expertise in how to survive and fight and win in a very demanding environment. Because a submarine is at any time, but when you're in hot climates, then it's even worse. And so they brought all that out to Trincomalee, and then started to work on what was there of the Japanese and also German and Italian submarines. However, they were to be disappointed, as we'll find out.
Yeah, and we'll go through the slides a minute. I'm glad you made that point about essentially transferable skills, because the weapons may change, the enemy may change, the climate may change, but good team skills, good dependability, and aggressive spirit, good leadership, those are transferable. And I'm guessing that, from what I know about the submarine warfare around Malta, and we've talked about it in the past with other guests on the channel, is that all those skills, the Mediterranean is very different to the Indian Ocean, but basic combat skills are readily transferable. And if you've got experienced crews, which is what you're saying they're bringing here, that works. And if we're talking about like we did with Mark Stilley on Friday, the Japanese, that they have peaked arguably 3 years earlier, that they are on the rapid descent of a downward trajectory, and have been for some time. So let's move on through some of the images, and we'll kind of carry this this conversation on. So HMS Tallyho. Right.
Okay. Quite a famous submarine. I've got some notes here, by the way, which I've extracted from my book, because it's 5 years since I wrote it, so I need
5 years and 600 pages. We wouldn't expect it all to be on the top of your tongue.
In my brain, I've been trying to get it in there. So I'm going to scroll down here where I've got the Tallyho bit. Okay, so HMS Tallyho. Right, let's have a look. I've got okay. It was commanded by Lieutenant Commander. I think it was a Lieutenant Commander. Lieutenant Commander Ben Bennington. Now he had been a pretty efficient and well-known submarine captain in the Mediterranean, and now was given this Triton-class submarine, Tallyho, and sent out to the Indian Ocean. And so he opened his account, really. I mean, the thing is, they were given targets of opportunity when they could get them. But the main point of the British submarines was to go into the shallow waters and basically nibble and destroy the logistical network of small boats. We're talking sampans, yachts, and others being used by the Japanese to supply their garrisons, which were still in the East Indies, as they were known. And that was their main objective, really. And that was pretty boring for them all, and very, very dangerous as well, which we can talk a little bit more about in a minute. But the thing is, Tallyho was able to, in fairly quick succession, to sink a Japanese light cruiser called the Kuma off Penang, because Penang was a major operating base for the Japanese and also for Italian and German submarines when they were there. So that was an uncharacteristic target, a very old cruiser, 24 years old, that had survived an attack by American bombers, but then when she came out from Penang, was attacked by Tallyho and hit by 2 torpedoes, which set her on fire, and then she sank stern first. And unfortunately for the Kuma, her depth charges were set, and they got to a certain depth and detonated and blew her up. So that was quite an uncharacteristic bit of luck for HMS Tallyho. But then about a month later, in February 1944, Tallyho managed to score an attack on an Italian submarine. And it might surprise people that the Italians were out there. And that's exactly what you've got there. And that was the Reginaldo Giuliani. And so she was, I mean, Italian submarines were quite large anyway, coming out to Penang to collect war materials. And this was, okay, so she'd come out to Penang as an Italian submarine, and then was at the surrender of Italy in September 1943. Italian submariners were given the choice. Did they want to go into the prisoner of war cage and be treated like other Allied prisoners by the Japanese, or did they want to carry on under German management, because German U-boats were operating from there as well, and still carry on with running war materials back to Europe, to Germany by then, because of course the Italians had surrendered. So UIT-23, as she was called, set out from Penang with a cargo of rubber and tin, which was headed for the German war industries. But unfortunately for UIT-23, which was then known, she was engaged by Tallyho and sunk. So that was another uncharacteristic piece of good luck when it comes to the ambitions of submarine captains to find that submarine there. But Tallyho carried on, having various scraps with the Japanese, including a famous one with an anti-submarine vessel on the surface, in which they circled each other, firing each other with cannons. And the Japanese vessel even got so close to Tallyho. This was on the same actual deployment. The ballast tanks of the submarine were ripped open, and she nearly didn't make it home. And the thing about submarine deployments at any time is that when a submarine goes out and dives, or in the case of a digital electric submarine, spends most of its time under the sea during the day, let's say up to 12 hours during the day, so they won't be spotted by the enemy, and then come up at night to recharge their batteries and run their diesel engines and go fast on the surface. I mean, that's how submarines work. During the day, they'll try and stay hidden if they can, although they might be able to do a fast transit in a vast ocean without being seen. But I'm trying not to get lost in this. But what I'm trying to explain is that the submarines that were based at Ceylon would leave for a 4-week patrol, and they would spend, let's say, a week or a week and a half getting to over vast distances, up to 1,000 miles, certainly hundreds of miles, to where they would lurk, let's say off Penang. And then they would spend a week there, keeping under the sea during the day and looking out for targets. So Tallyho was lucky to find the Japanese cruiser and the Italian U-boat, and then unfortunately met the the Japanese anti-submarine vessel went on the surface and had that scrap. So she was away for, let's say, 3 weeks of her 4-week patrol, and nobody would have heard from her. And a submarine would not transmit on the radio, though they could pick up signals. So when the depot ship, where the flotilla HQ is, said goodbye to Tallyho, they wouldn't know she would come back. And if a submarine was encountered by the enemy and attacked and sunk, often they wouldn't know what happened to them, sometimes to this day. So when Tallyho returned from her early 1944 patrol with the sort of ripped open ballast tanks, they were absolutely stunned that the submarine had made it, and they actually thought that perhaps that would have been the last of Tallyho. I don't know if that's a clear enough description of some of the detail, but
no, it is. And thank you very much. And we've got a few questions that are coming in there, and you're talking about these surface engagements as well, because everybody watching this, you think submarines, you think torpedoes, and when torpedoes come up, the faulty American torpedoes always comes up as a subject, but we often kind of overlook deck guns. We overlook the fact they have other armaments. So Scott Grimwood is saying, did these Royal Navy subs have deck guns, and if yes, what type?
Yes, they did. And in fact, the most heavily armed British submarines of World War II, when it comes to deck guns, were the Far East submarines. And something that applies particularly to one of the other submarines that we're going to talk about, HMS Storm. But they were not only were attempts made to try and make them a little bit more habitable, because they were like ovens inside, but they also realized that if they were going into shallow coastal waters, the littorals, they would need to have more guns, because guns were the thing. So let's look at Tallyho, or just your generic British submarine. That would have a 3 or a 4-inch main gun, and then there would be a 20mm cannon, and then there would be machine guns. And those often were the main, certainly the 3 or 4-inch gun would be the main weapon against the enemy small craft and small warships, and also the small craft like the sampans and the other vessels carrying supplies. Because if you're in very shallow water and you fire a torpedo, the torpedo will come out the tube, and it'll do a kind of a dip, and then it will run, because it then runs towards the target. And the chances were that if you use the torpedo in shallow water, such as they were in, then it would just go into the mud, and that wouldn't be very good. So there was a lot of gunnery in this stage of the war for the submarines in the Far East, the British submarines in the Far East.
Brilliant. And talking about shallow water, because we talked about that as being a primary aspect of this British role here. Sean Brennan is saying, and my understanding is British large submarines had difficulties in the Med, as they could be spotted by air in a shallow wave, even while submerged. They then chose to use them in shallow water in the Far East. So was that something, the problem of visibility? And do the Japanese still have a threat at this point in terms of seeing submarines in shallow water?
Okay, so am I right if you said the British then used large submarines in the Far East? Right, okay. Right, those submarines that were used, and they had a horrific casualty rate, as he says, in the Med, particularly in 1940, summer 1940. Those were old submarines that were built, let's say, in 1929, 1930. Some of them came from the China station, and they were big. But the S-boats, the S-class boats that were sent to the Far East in 1944, 43 to 45, they were smaller, and it's still about 200 feet long, but they were smaller. And the same goes for the T-class, the Triton class. They were smaller than those boats, and they were. I would say that, I mean, if you think Malacca Strait, notorious for having clear water, and tricky that, if an enemy aircraft is overhead, then it could spot you at a shallow depth. But the thing about the Japanese was that they weren't terribly coordinated when it comes to their anti-submarine forces, and they never were, and they didn't really exploit them in the way that they should have. Obviously, probably their sharpest game was against the Americans, I would say, off the Japanese home islands, where they claimed some notable submarine losses, like the Wahoo and much more than there. But I mean, the extraordinary thing is, and I must admit, this is something I was reading today when I was boning up. I was reading a book by Alistair Mars which I used before, but I thought I'd just read the Far East chapters on it again. He said Alistair Mars, as we'll come on to him, was a famous Triton class submarine captain who was in the Far East at the end of World War II and also in the Med. He said that of all the submarines in the Indian Ocean, and also that strayed into the sort of the American side towards the Pacific, only 2 British submarines were sunk that it is known by enemy action, which I find quite extraordinary. And he's talking about the 44 to 45 period. I mean, I'll have to read it again, but you know, I think that's probably correct.
Thank you. And one more question, we'll go back to the slide. So Scott Grimwood again is saying, did Royal Navy subs have radar in 1945?
I'm sure they did. They did have radar. It wouldn't be quite the same radar set as the Americans would have, because they had different needs. But I'm pretty sure they had radar. I mean, all Royal Navy warships would get radar. They have a radar mast. But I mean, that's something that I might need to double check. But I'm pretty sure they would have. Okay. I should know that, shouldn't I?
Well, you're doing very well fielding most of them so far. So let's move through more slides, because you've got some amazing images here. So HMS Trenchant. Let's talk about.
Yeah, Trenchant. Right. So, quite a famous submarine. Tallyho's a famous submarine. This is another one, commanded by another famous, certainly in the Royal Navy, famous submarine captain, who was called Arthur Baldy, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Baldy Hesler. I don't know why he was called Baldy, but he was, maybe because he was going bald. But she was another T-class boat sent out to the Far East, and also notched up quite a record. And I mean, we can go into that if you want a little bit now. So
you do.
Anyway, as it says in the slide, what happened was Trenchant was sent out in September 1944 to do one of the usual jobs, which was to poke around into shallow waters, but to land commandos, and there's quite a bit of that went on, commandos, and they would go on raids behind Japanese lines on various islands and various other places around Singapore, wherever it was, to help also to spot targets for, let's say, carrier strikes, etc. So she had Trenchant had done that, and then managed to receive a signal from the flotilla command saying that it would be a good idea if Trenchant went and loitered off just checking this, off Penang. That's right, yeah. And they told him that he had a signal. It instructed him, as his Heslet, to place Trenchant in the northern channel to the port on the morning of the 23rd of September. Now, I'm pretty sure this was due to a couple of things. One was the ultra product, i.e. crack the codes, the German codes, because this was a U-boat that was coming, that was already in the Indian Ocean, was going to be at Penang. Now, this same U-boat, which was U-859, had sunk a few ships in the Indian Ocean. I think some of them were off Madagascar, and had been spotted by a Catalina as well. And it was a bit of a shame for this submarine, because it's was a type of submarine which used a snorkel, which is the ability to poke a mast above the sea and expel the fumes of a diesel generator and pull in fresh air as the batteries recharged, to basically stay hidden. Keeping it very simple, to stay hidden from the enemy. But unfortunately, Catalina did spot U-859, and the Enigma code had been broken, and so Heslet was told to place Trenchant in that position and wait for this submarine, which is what he did. And so U-859, apart from sinking enemy shipping out there, would probably also have been tasked with working from Penang, and then would probably take stuff back to Germany, which is what U-boats did, as well as the Italian submarines. So Heslet fires 3 torpedoes. He hits with 1, and the explosion broke the enemy submarine in 2. And there's a good story here, which I will share now, because people have asked me about it before. So Trenchant stayed around to pick up survivors and took aboard some prisoners. And there was only one officer among them, and that was a guy called, he was the second engineer, and he was called Oberleutnant Horst Klatt. And they asked him, how did he come to survive? And he said he was the only officer to survive the submarine. And this is a grim story, but the sort of dark humor attached to it that sometimes happens in war. But he was the only officer to survive from this U-boat because he'd had diarrhea. And so he'd been in the heads of the toilets at the time that Hazlitt's attack took place. But the rest of the officers in the submarine were having a conference in the wardroom, and that was near where the torpedo hit. And so they were all killed. So that's quite a famous, grim story. But his life was saved by a dose of diarrhea. So he's a lucky man.
That's almost similar to my going off on a complete rabbit hole now. My grandfather, who spent 6 years in the Royal Artillery and anti-aircraft, the one time a German aircraft strafed one of the areas he was working he was mostly in charge of signals and telephones, his camp, he was in the toilet and missed it. So the only time there
you go.
Sometimes it can save your life being in the toilet. Yeah.
And maybe it took a newspaper, so that helped, Yeah.
Anyway.
So
another photo there. So we haven't finished with the Trenchant yet.
No. And this is leaping forward a bit because out of the chronology, because I thought you might as well keep Trenchant's exploits in one. Ashigara was a cruiser, heavy cruiser, that was known to be lurking about. I mean, obviously the Americans, although it wasn't known, a bit like the penetration of the German codes wasn't known, the Americans were also into the Japanese codes as well, and that has some bearing on something we'll talk about shortly as well. And so they may have had information there. But anyway, Trenchant, still with Lieutenant Commander Hazlitt in command, have been sent forward with other submarines by June, summer of 1945, to work out a Fremantle. And so he was sent off on a deployment to go up towards, I think he was going up towards Brunei. And while he was on his way up there, he received a message saying, basically, we want you to go and see if you can sink the Ashigara, because we've got intelligence that submarine is going to be in the Banker Strait, from whatever source it was from. So Trenchant was able to place herself in the Banker Strait. And so at 11:48 on the 7th of June 1945, the Ashigara came into the view of Hazlitt's periscope, and steaming at 17 knots, 6 miles away from the submarine at that point in the south, and with 1,200 troops on board that were being taken from Batavia, which I think is I can't remember the modern name of that, but that's the old-fashioned name, Batavia to Singapore. And so she had an escorting destroyer, the Kamikaze, which was quite vigilant and had a sniff around and even an encounter with Trenchant and another submarine called a Stygian, a British submarine, but didn't actually hang around long enough to do anything about the following action, which was Hazlitt managed to close down the range to this cruiser as she came barreling up the strait to 3,000 yards and fired 8 torpedoes, which was the full forward salvo of a Triton-class submarine, and hoped to take out the Ashigara in one blow. And what happened was 5 torpedoes hit, the cruiser's bow was blown off, and unfortunately it took a lot of lives with it, and sort of ran aground, and that was the end of the Ashigara. And that was, again, an uncharacteristic achievement for a British submarine, because it was a major vessel, a major Japanese Navy vessel. And Trenchant was able to evade some depth charging by the Kamikaze, and saw the Japanese destroyer move away to pick up survivors, and then made her exit. And it's an interesting quote that Hazlitt uses in his own autobiography, which came out about 20 odd years ago. And he said that triumphalism is a dirty word now, but back then it was certainly not. And we particularly thought of the British cruiser Exeter, whose destruction had been wrought mainly by Ashigara. That would be back in 1942, the Battle of the Java Sea. And so I would say that submariners, like other servicemen, don't take any great joy or glee in killing the enemy, but I think they do take some satisfaction from balancing the books when they feel that, this people on their own side have been killed, like the Exeter, famous British cruiser.
It came up in a sidebar. They mentioned the Exeter, and Batavia is Jakarta these days, just for those that William came up with that. So, I mean, these are extraordinary actions, and the common theme in the sidebar is that people don't know much about this, is that they're learning a lot. This is an area that they've not learned more about. So good for this. So let's move on. So S-class submarines, because that's the thing, but submarines come in all shapes and sizes, and we'll get to midget submarines later on, which of course the British used across the globe. And I'm glad, thank you for reminding us that the Royal Navy are taking submarines to pretty much every bit of water across the entire planet. But yeah, S-class. Let's set the scene for this then.
Okay, so the S-class. The S-class is a smaller kind of submarine, probably an older design, I would say as well, but a very reliable and very trusty submarine. This is HMS Storm, which is quite famous in the submarine circles, commanded by a guy called Edward Young, Lieutenant Commander Edward Young. And so commissioned in July 1943, Edward Young was an experienced submarine junior officer in the Mediterranean and in European waters, and then promoted, because most submarine captains were lieutenant commanders. So they were, like in the equivalent in the army would be captain or major or whatever. And so they were young men. Some of them only in their early 20s, their mid 20s, and he was, I think, 30 at this time. So he was quite old, but he was very experienced. And so Storm commissioned July 1943, did a patrol off Norway, and then went out to the Far East and got to Ceylon on the 27th of December 1943. Yeah. So she then embarked on notching up her amazing record as a gunslinger, if you like, as a submarine that would go into shallow waters, all guns blazing. And in fact, Young's submarine was so packed full of ammunition. It was absolutely stuffed with ammunition that it was said that if the Admiralty's munitions inspectors had gone on board, they would have had a heart attack, because it was stuffed under the wardroom table, and also even in engineering spaces where it could be detonated by the heat. I mean, she wasn't blown up, but these submarines were stuffed with supplies, whether it was food underfoot, where they made false decks for food, and so sailors would put a false deck of tinned food and then put something over the top of it, a covering over it, and that would be a temporary deck. But they would take food under their feet, and and a submarine like Storm was stuffed full of ammunition for all the guns. And during one engagement, it was Storm went in there after an enemy target and used her 3-inch gun, fired 150 shells, and it said that it got it got so hot that it jammed, and the ammunition they had an Oerlikon cannon, and also the machine guns ran out. So that showed you how fierce she was. And after she came back, Admiral Sir James Somerville, who was the commander of the fleet out in the Eastern Fleet out there at the time, sent a message to Young, quite a famous message, saying that the enemy must have thought that HMS Storm, that you were a typhoon. So, I mean, they like sending numerous messages. But she's quite a renowned submarine. And the thing about Edward Young was that before the war, he worked in publishing. And it's another famous story about him. And if anybody's ever looked at a Penguin paperback, Penguin book, and looked at the drawing of the Penguin, and certainly the early designs of Penguin books, that was actually by Edward Young, because he was a graphic designer and worked in publishing. And he was the man that came up with the Penguin for Penguin books, because he went to the London Zoo and sketched it. So he was quite famous for that. So he was these guys had quite an interesting background in civilian life as well. But I mean, that's HMS Storm. It's just he wrote a book of his own about it as well. So if anybody wants to dive into Edward Young's book, then I would highly recommend it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And before we kind of move on to the next story, just another one about logistics. We talked about distance. Leslie is just saying, where were these subs built and what route did they take to get to the Far East? So, we talked about crews and things coming from the Mediterranean. Did the subs come from as many different places? Were they manufactured in the UK and sent out there? Give us a rundown. I know there's different classes of submarines, so maybe it's a complicated question, but
no,
have a go.
It's not complicated. They were built in Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about World War II submarines, I mean, the Admiralty was a massive organisation, and so it had immense resources, but it had to divide up its resources between, do we want to build battleships or destroyers or frigates? And submarines were could be an efficient way of creating an offensive weapon and an offensive force. And it would take a year to build a submarine, and it would be built in a British shipyard. And I know certainly during World War One, some submarines were built in America, but somebody may correct me, but I don't think any of our submarines were built. Although we might have had one or two old American-built ones at the start of World War II. None of the modern submarines were built outside the UK. So it'd take about a year. So, in fact, this is one of the other submarines we're going to talk about. I think I've got the details here of her. I'm just having a look. Hang on. I'm scrolling down because I might have an actual date for something. Yeah, wait a minute. No, it's not that one. It's another one. Anyway, one of the submarines, for example, a Triton-class submarine could be laid down in the April of a year and then completed at a British dockyard, whether it was Plymouth, Chatham, or some kind of other yard, places that today don't build warships and aren't naval. But we had yards everywhere in Britain, and so and it could be on the Mersey. So a submarine could be started in the April, launched in the December, and would be finished by the following April, and then out to sea, within a few months, and then after a process of working up, which is to make sure all the systems work, torpedoes, the communications gear, that she will dive safely and come back up again. That's essential. And that the crew are worked up as well. Because without the people being worked up with a good captain, you've got nothing. So let's say you built a submarine in April 1943. By, let's say, July 1944, that submarine could be at the Far East, but would sail all the way out there. They would go from Britain, maybe via the Med, the Suez Canal, down through the Red Sea, and then out into the Indian Ocean. So no, I mean, they came from Britain, and they got there under their own diesel electric and diesel electric power.
Well, brilliant stuff. Thank you. Well explained. Yeah. We'll move on through the slides. People are loving it. So next story, next sub.
Okay, and right. Okay, so Thule or Tool, I think Thule is another Triton T-class submarine. And interesting thing about these submarines, they're different batches. You've got two torpedo tubes that are external, and you can see the snout there to the pressure hull in the casing, and you can't reload those two torpedo tubes. I would point at the screen, but you can just see the snout, like nostrils at the front.
There's been a discussion, a sidebar, about the merits of external tubes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this submarine could have up to 5. So there were 2 external tubes at the front, and then there were 3 at the back, and they were backwards pointing, and then there were 6 in reloadable tubes as well. So you couldn't reload the external. So you fired them, that was that. But you could obviously reload the 6 below the waterline in the bow, and you had, I think, up to 18 torpedoes for that purpose. So Alistair Mars had proved himself in command of, I mentioned, I think, Unbroken there, in command of Unbroken in the Mediterranean, and on the periphery of the pedestal convoy, the famous convoy of merchant ships, massively protected by the Royal Navy, to Malta in August 1942. Alistair Mars worked on the periphery round by Sicily, and managed to damage 2. I think he damaged 2. Again, it's in my book, but we're talking years ago since I wrote it. But I'm pretty sure he damaged 2 cruisers, Italian cruisers, which were later finished off by Allied forces, like air forces, and so that was one of his major achievements. He then went and worked in the HQ of the British Submarine Service in London, as it was then, under Flag Officer Submarines, and was promised a submarine out in the Far East. And so the submarine he eventually got was Thule, and sent out to Trincomalee and to work from the depot ship there. And it's worth pointing out that depot ships that we mentioned earlier, they supplied engineering support, weapons, They could, repair things that went wrong. They had cinemas on board. They had command HQs on board. They had some accommodation on board. And then elsewhere, there would be accommodation ships, because submariners do not live aboard their vessels, unlike people in surface warships, because they're too small and they need a break from it, really. So he went out to Trincomalee, where the depot ship welcomed him, the staff welcomed him. He was quite a controversial character. He often rubbed people up the wrong way, but he was a very determined individual. And so Toole, with a crew of 64, was sent off on numerous missions, often to land commandos and even a platoon of Royal Marines on covert missions, and went hundreds and hundreds of miles, up to 1,000 miles on transits from Ceylon through the Sunda Strait or the Malacca Strait, and then up round towards Singapore to drop people off on secret missions. And on one occasion picked up people, including 3 Americans who were from the crew of a B-29 that had been shot down by the Japanese and had managed to evade capture. So Alistair Mars specialised in that kind of mission and did quite a lot of those, much to his frustration, I would say, sometimes, because he'd like to have sunk an enemy warship, but it wasn't to be. And so, yeah, that's him there.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Iain, because James said the same thing on his show, is that, by this point in the war, there aren't necessarily always offensive roles for these submarines, and dropping off commandos, rescuing downed aviators. It's all part of the game. It's, adaptability is in many ways the key to the Allied success in World War II. It's efficiency, making sure that it's, that everything has a use and there's an economy about things. And, you've spent all this time training up crews. You've got these vessels, you've got these craft. If the primary use of them isn't available to you, use them for something else. And if you do all three, and that's, James is making the same point about the American submarines, that one day they can be on offensive operations against Japanese merchant vessels. The next day they're picking up downed airmen. That's how it was. Yeah,
but I mean, it's interesting what we were talking about earlier by, talking about the sharp weapon and the experienced people. That was actually a problem. These missions were actually a major problem for the Royal Navy in terms of the morale of its people, which is something I was going to mention earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning now. In what you had by 1945 was you had a mix of people, let's say in a submarine. So let's say you have an experienced captain who's fought in the Mediterranean, or as a young officer who's been second in command of a submarine and has come up and he's now the CEO of a submarine. He's been sent to the Far East, and he has visions of doing a great job of sinking enemy battleships and cruisers and things. And then you have your junior rating, your most junior sailor who's probably fresh to the Navy. This might be their first submarine, who's thinking, well, the war has ended back in Europe, and here am I. I've been stuck with going out in this submarine to the Far East when other people like my mates are in the army or whatever or wherever being demobbed, or the war's over. And then bizarrely enough, you would have senior ratings who were professional sailors who'd probably been in the Navy years, who were thinking, well, we need more action. And returning to the CO, let's say, of this fictional submarine with this mix of people in, a lot of them decided that after a few patrols of doing those jobs, they didn't want to do them anymore, and they actually said that they wanted to resign and go home. So there was a morale problem, or a keeping the weapon sharp problem, if you like. Doing these grueling forays into shallow waters, because often it needed very demanding navigation, and often when they were in the shallow waters trying to get at sampans and sink junks, and it wasn't very pleasant to sink these small craft that belonged to local people who were asked by the Japanese, let's say, to transport rice or something else from A to B, and a Royal Navy submarine comes along and sinks or shoots or rams their boat. They didn't kill the crew; they let the crew get off, but they've lost their livelihood. So it was a kind of an unpleasant task, and it was very risky sometimes for people to go on board, because they boarded them as well. And some officers had ropes tied around them, so that when they went on a sampan and let's say the sampan or the vessel, whatever the other vessel was, a yacht, made off at speed, they could be hauled back onto their own submarine. And so it was a difficult job. and an unpleasant job. And often when they were in the shallow waters, they couldn't dive the submarine. So if they were caught by a Japanese aircraft and they were like 2 or 3 miles from water that they could dive in, and of course the submarine had it. So it worked probably on their mind as well. And so there was this balance of keeping submariners active and keeping their aggression sharp, keeping their morale up with, you know, worthwhile missions, was something that was being eroded. Not in all of the submarine captains and their crews, but in some of them. So you had that. I mean, without repeating myself, you did have that strange mix of people who maybe didn't want to be there for different reasons.
Mm. Well, Will Iredale said the same thing on the show he did with us about the Royal Navy anti-kamikaze response from the surface vessels, that by 45, morale is at all different places depending on who you are in a crew. As you say, replacements, old hands, someone to carry on and be aggressive, someone to go back home, and keeping everybody focused on perhaps a less glamorous job was quite difficult. You know, it was maybe easier in the when your back is against the wall and you're losing the war, it's easy to keep focused. When you're starting to see the end in sight and the job is getting a bit not boring, but you don't quite understand what you're doing. I can understand why that came in, but we're going down a rabbit hole about morale. It's fantastic insight. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons that when by 1945, when the truth was that the targets were gone, you know, for the British in their zone, you know, that zone we mentioned earlier. So it was then suggested to Ernie King, the head of the US Navy, and I'm sure to Nimitz not to Nimitz because he was in the Pacific, but Ernie King, and also the American submarine admirals based forward in Australia. But Ernie King was the head of the US Navy in the USA, and I think a former submariner himself. And then certainly Nimitz was, and then the American admirals in Australia who were looking after their forward submarine operations were approached, and it was said, you know, we've run out of things we want to do. Can we please come around the corner and be based at Fremantle and maybe in the Philippines to try and get a bit more of the action? And that then brings us to another aspect of it, which we'll reach in a minute. This aspect. So midget submarines, and the Americans, apart from having British submarines, what we might call normal British submarines or full-size British submarines operating out of Fremantle and the Philippines, and still working in the Indian Ocean as well, the British were keen to use their midget submarines again because they'd had success in European waters, in Norwegian waters, famously, you know, the attack on Tirpitz, putting her out of action, September 1943. And this chap here, Max Sheehan, was an Australian, like a lot of Australians, quite a few Australians served in the Royal Navy in European waters, as well as went back to his native waters. But he basically was part of the Royal Navy in the X-craft midget submarines. And as it notes there, he won a medal, got a medal for blowing up, doing a daring raid against a Norwegian an Axis port in Norway and blowing up a merchant vessel. So he was one of the midget submarine captains, lieutenants, I think. In this case, they were, you know, it was just a 4-man crew, so they were, you know, it was lieutenants that took charge of these boats. And so a guy called Captain William Fell was in charge of the midget submarines, and they had their own depot ship called the Bonaventure, and the Bonaventure was sent out to the Far East and to Australia, to Fremantle. And Captain Fell, who was in command of these midget submarines on the Bonaventure, wanted to have a mission for them. So he flew around the Pacific, meeting his American counterparts, saying, "Gear's a job. You know, we want to do something with these midget submarines and show you what they can do." And the Americans were not entirely convinced that there was something for them to do. It's certainly in terms of getting Japanese vessels that were, let's say, as we'll come to in a second, trapped in a harbour somewhere, because they thought, well, if they come out, we'll sink them. If they're in a harbour, it doesn't matter. So they weren't entirely convinced. But Captain Fell managed to persuade the Americans that there were two missions that the four midget submarines could do. And one was to cut Japanese communication cables, and the other one was to attack 2 Japanese heavy cruisers that had been damaged by the Americans at the end of 1944 and were at Singapore behind various layers of protection. So I mean, it's worth just explaining a bit about this, I think. So
yeah, please.
With that, yeah, okay. So right, so the cable cutting, a useful thing to do. Fell is told by the Americans, yeah, we'll let you do that. So what does that mean? That means that 2 midget submarines will be sent to cut the following. And midget submarines are towed into action by big submarines. They have a depot ship. In this case, the depot ship went forward to be based in what's today Indonesia. It's somewhere in Indonesia, and I've forgotten the name of it. But there were 2 missions in different places. So the cable cutting mission, right? So I'll try and get this right. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll down here a bit. Right, okay. So the cables that were to be cut were were between Japanese commanders and their bosses, and these were seabed wireless cables, let's say, and one was between Singapore and Saigon, and the other one was between Saigon and Hong Kong. And the reason that it would be a good idea to cut them was that would mean that the Japanese could not send secure communications via these cables on the seabed, and would be forced to use wireless transmissions. And that would mean that the wireless transmissions could be intercepted, and then the code's broken, the message is broken, decrypted, and then the Americans and us would know what the Japanese were up to. So the I'm just consulting my thing here because I'm trying to get the right names for each one. Right, and then the other mission would be to sink the Takao and also the Miyoko, and they were at Singapore, as I mentioned. So I'm just going to scroll down here a bit. Right, so if we could take the cable cutting bit first. The interesting thing about this is what is okay. So that was XE4, and the other submarine was XE5. So XE5 was sent against the cable of Hong Kong, and XE4, commanded by Max Sheehan, was sent against a cable of Saigon. So, right. So, how did they do it? They were got in position, towed into position by bigger submarines, and then they went in the case of Max Sheehan, into the Mekong Delta in search of a cable that dated back to the 1870s, communication telegraph cable, to find it. And he used a specialized grapple to find this cable, and then sent out, having hooked the cable, they then sent out divers to cut the cable. And they used powered cutters to cut the cable off Saigon. And then that was a success. And to prove that they'd done it, they brought back a piece of the cable with a ribbon around it to prove that they'd actually succeeded in cutting that particular one. Now, XE5, which was sent to cut the communications cable of Hong Kong, it appeared to have failed in its mission, but actually after the war they found out that it succeeded. Now, how much impact it had on the war, I don't know, but it was I think if you think about latter day events in the Baltic, attacking communication cables is something that people do when they want to gain an advantage, whether it's over a covert. So the midget submarine succeeded in that mission, and now on the same time, XE3, commanded by Lieutenant Iain Fraser, and XE1, commanded by Lieutenant John Smart, was sent into Singapore to attack these 2 cruisers. So Fraser's target is the Takao, and so towed up there by the submarine, set free, they slowly make their way up to Singapore, and they're going to enter the Johor Strait, which separates Singapore and the Malayan Peninsula, and that's where these cruisers are lying behind submarine nets and other protection in very shallow water. So for XE3 and Fraser, that meant going 12 miles up what was a narrow channel, and it was only half a mile wide. And so dodging patrols on the morning of the 31st of July, XE3, this is 1945, managed to slip through the anti-submarine net. And this is a concise account. And then the next thing was to go through very clear waters and get underneath the cruiser and put limpet mines on the hull of the cruiser, and also drop charges. Because the thing about the X-craft was they had explosive charges either side of the hull, or on one side of the hull in this case, and a container of mines on the other, which would drop under a vessel to blow it up and hopefully put it out of action. Because the reason that they wanted to take out the cruisers was that when the British and Allied troops made their move to liberate Singapore, it was feared that these two 8-inch gun Japanese cruisers would be able to bombard the attacking force. So they wanted to make sure that their guns couldn't be used as part of resistance to Operation Male Fist, as it was called, the campaign to kick the Japanese out of Singapore. Right. So Ian Fraser has a diver called McGuinness, who's James McGuinness, leading seaman James McGuinness. Now, he's going to be the guy that goes out once the midget submarine is under Takao and attaches the limpet mines. And Fraser will position the submarine under the cruiser to drop the massive charge, except it didn't quite go like that. So, right, having managed to sneak in to the cruiser, he found out that basically there was only about 4 to 6 feet underneath the Takao, and that would be very difficult to slide even a midget submarine under there. But there was a part of the seabed under there that had an 18-foot deep cleft, if you like, which through wriggling the midget submarine, Fraser was able to insert XE3 into. Right. So as the X-craft got under the cruiser, they were able to see the hull of the ship through a porthole in the top, and daylight was filtering down through this, and you can see the barnacles and all the rest of it. So with XE3 settled in the mud, McGuinness then got into his diving suit and pulled on his breathing apparatus and mask, and he exited the boat for a lockout chamber, and he then put magnetic mines on the hull of the Takao. And Fraser dropped the explosive charge. But the problem was, and I'm keeping this simple, the problem was that the tide was going out when this was happening. And I'm just checking this. And what happened was, yes, that's right. And so the hull of the Takao was actually pressing down on the top of the midget submarine, and cracked the midget submarine. And so what Fraser had to do was sort of wriggle the submarine until he could, like some kind of fish in a sea on a riverbed, until all the mud was out of the way, and then withdraw the submarine. But having done that and not being noticed by anybody aboard the cruiser, despite all the activity, they then found that the XE3 was snagged by the limpet mine container. So McGuinness had to go out in crystal clear waters, hoping nobody would look over the side of the cruiser, and get rid of this container. And eventually they managed to get away. And XC, the other X-craft, XE1, didn't manage to even get under Myoko, and came over and dropped his charge nearby. And so they then withdrew. And to keep awake, these submariners would sometimes take Benzodrine. So they were taking Benzodrine to keep themselves awake, because they had to be awake and sharp for hours and hours at a time to get this mission over and done with. And I mean, the air inside was foul, and the conditions were terrible, and it could have been, and if they'd been spotted and they'd been captured, then the Japanese might well have executed them on the spot. And so it was a very, very hazardous mission, but they got away with it. They got back out to rendezvous with their mother submarines, as it were, and they watched. And I've got a little twist in the tail to tell you in a minute. I'll have a break, but for people to ask questions. But there is a nice little twist in the tail. But anyway, they withdrew to a distance, and they saw an explosion, and they thought that was the Takao just going boom, and so they thought it was a job well done.
Wow. I mean, incredible stories, and the takeaway is the flexibility of it. Dropping commandos, picking up aviators, hitting sampans in shallow water, hitting cruisers in harbors, going out actions against other submarines. I mean, it's that flexibility is the key thing. And you've just highlighted a handful of stories. Clearly, there are plenty more if we had all the time in the world. But we've got a couple of questions. Then we'll come to your next point. So Peter O'Connell is saying. And again, there's different subtitles. What sort of range endurance did Royal Navy subs have compared to the US Navy fleet subs?
Right. I mean, I can't off the top of my head give you the. Did I put it in the caption? I did put it in the caption. If you go back to the Triton boat and the S-class,
hang on.
I mean, American submarines were like the Rolls-Royce. You could call them the Rolls-Royce treatment. So, I mean, I might have put this in the Deadly Trade. I could look it up. I've got a whole library of books here. I mean, it probably would be thousands of miles at a certain speed. So, I mean, if you look at what they managed to squeeze out, and that would be with the ballast tanks with lubricating on and in them, so there was more room for actual fuel. So that's 11,000 nautical miles surface at 10 knots, and the S-class also had their range experience, so several thousand miles, but always the inhibiting factor to Royal Navy submarines or any submarine was you had to try and do as much of your time on the surface as a submersible, because once you were dived, you could maybe get I think it was one of the I think it was the Triton or the S-class. You could probably get 500 or 600 miles dived if you went along at, let's say, so you could get a whole day and a half submerged on your battery if you went at 2 knots. But if you went at full speed, 9 knots, you had an hour and a half. So, I know that's not quite answering the question, but I'm sure the Americans had probably more range than the British ones. But that's because they're for a different job.
Well, the Scott Grumman is saying is a US Gatto class sub has a range of 11,000 miles. So about very similar.
Yeah. But that probably wasn't with using ballast tanks for the fuel, for the lubricating oil.
Okay, a question from Gwilym about when they dropped commandos or covert missions, did they reduce the crews of the submarines to accommodate Marines?
No, because obviously you have to run a submarine on a watch basis, so you need people to be on an off watch. If I can find it, I'll tell you exactly how many people they had. But they had a whole platoon on one of Miles's missions. They had a whole platoon of Royal Marines, but they also had. And I'm doing this off the top of my head. I've got the details here, but I can't find them. They also had like boats as well, sort of inflatable boats they had to carry, and all their equipment, all their weaponry, and they also had engines for these boats, and they had to go in very shallow and basically park the submarine and had a whole load of supplies. So they had to park the submarine in 16 feet of water, which meant that the submarine was exposed, and then all these Marines had to get off and then use these boats to ferry ashore ammunition supplies for guerrillas ashore and their own stuff. And it took 3 or 4 hours. And so Alistair Miles was sort of paranoid, or quite rightly so, that they were going to get destroyed by the Japanese coming along. But it was a guerrilla-controlled area. But they stuffed them in wherever they could.
I mean, it doesn't. I mean, all the sardines analogies you want to make, folks. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about all those body odors and all the weaponry.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to go there.
Claustrophobia. I mean, my God. Yeah. But obviously, when we're talking about this chapter of the war, we now know that very suddenly in August, atomic bombs gets dropped, and the world enters an entirely new era. And Oppenheimer came out this year, and it's on everybody's lips again there. But David Kay is asking, if that hadn't happened, if they hadn't dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what were the roles envisioned, if any, for Royal Navy subs during downfall planning? So had we not dropped the nukes, had we planned to carry on and attack Japan via land and sea, would the subs have been used? And if so, how?
Yeah, they would have done. They would have gone forward, like the Americans with their submarine depot ships. They would have gone forward to wherever was the nearest to the Japanese home islands for them with their range, but that's an interesting point about the and it gives me this twist in the tail just about the X-craft. If I may just
Please do.
Digress there, right? So, okay, and I got this when I was researching the deadly trade. I listened to Ian Fraser's sound recording at the Imperial War Museum, which is fantastic, and he revealed something which I didn't actually get in the book. So actually, I'm telling you about it here, and I think I had to trim it out. But one thing I did get in was that when they looked at the aerial photographs of the two cruisers, in particular Takao at Singapore, they realised that the cruiser had not been blown up. And apparently it was actually an aircraft crashing at not detonated. It was actually an aircraft crashing at an airfield. So what happened was that Fraser was called in to see Captain Fell, who showed him these photographs and said that he said that what was he said to him? He said to Fraser, "We've got to do something about this. You'll have to go back and attack the Takao again." And I put this in the book. I said that Fraser was not too keen on this, and he said that it really did upset him because he thought he'd done a successful attack. So they timed another attack, which, if you can imagine all the risks he took the first time, would be, probably his death sentence, and that of any other midget submarines going in, because they would be extra ready for them. But what happened was Fraser was out on the upper deck of the Bonaventure watching a movie and preparing, trying to relax before going in again against this enemy cruiser or cruisers. And Captain Fell came out and said that that the operation had been delayed, but a nuclear bomb had been dropped on Japan. Well, an atom bomb had been dropped on Japan, and then they still thought they might have to do it. And then the next bomb was dropped shortly afterwards, and that was the attack on Takao was obviously called off. And so they didn't have to go in and do that. And they were very, very relieved. But the thing was, when Fraser and McGuinness were being flown back to Britain to get their Victoria Crosses, because they were each awarded the Victoria Cross. Yeah. And this is the bit I didn't put in the book. They actually went to see the cruiser, which by then had been, was being still looked after by the Japanese sailors, but actually... was under our jurisdiction because the war had ended. And so Fraser went to see the cruiser, went on board, and he met a Japanese officer who, this is what he said in his sound recording, who'd been educated at Oxford and spoke in a very refined English accent. And that officer showed him around the ship, and Fraser thought he was worried, this guy's going to take revenge on me because we must have blown this vessel up and maybe we might have killed somebody in it. But in fact, the Japanese explained that they'd already taken the ammunition for the 8-inch guns off the ship, so there was no way they could use it to bombard any attacking force. And the ship just settled the already damaged Takao a little bit further in the water. So the attack, although spectacular in terms of execution and winning Fraser and McGuinness the VC, actually had been rather pointless. But anyway, that's a story he told himself.
Wow. Well, we will bring things to an end here. I mean, I just wanted to have one little kind of summary for me. So there's your book on screen there, and several people in the sidebar have said they've already ordered it or they've requested it for Christmas. So a few more pennies in the royalty coffers there, which is fantastic. Yeah, and the link is in the description below, folks. So, we talked at the beginning of this about it being a kind of a lesser known story. Yeah. Generally when it comes to submarines, I mean, I know what your answer is going to be. Too many books on U-boats, not enough about the wider story. Is that where we are?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of U-boat books. Yeah, there's something. I mean, there's it's a I won't say a myth, but it's a story that that lives large. I mean, the U-boats suffered 30,000 out of 40,000 of U-boat men killed in the Second World War, and that's horrendous, truly horrendous. So if you look at the Royal Navy, they only ever had 88 submarines. I mean, obviously submarines were replaced, and you had a force. And I'm just using a round figure here because I know the figures in the book. So let's say you have 5,000 men altogether, and 6,000 men, and maybe 2,000. And don't forget, those men will be cycled through the service, and maybe 2,000 men altogether killed. It doesn't lessen the sacrifice, but the scale of death and destruction was far less. And the job of the Royal Navy, because it wasn't against the biggest merchant fleet in the world, which of course was Britain's, and of course the Norwegian merchant fleet as well, and the other merchant fleets. It wasn't a war of commerce, was it? It was It was different for the Royal Navy. So I suppose the U-boats have got that grip because they had that kind of massive campaign in the Atlantic, which always grabs people's imaginations. But the Royal Navy's story, certainly in its submarine service, was quite extraordinary for different reasons in both world wars, and so is the US navies and all the navies really. But I mean, the American Navy story is also quite extraordinary as well.
No, definitely. And I think, we talked about it with Harry Cooper last night. The U-boat phenomenon is still largely based on the fact the Germans made such a big deal of it in terms of their propaganda at the time. It was when the war was turning against them, they still had, like they had the Luftwaffe aces and these tank aces, they had these few things they could hold on to as something they could tell their people about. That was sort of going their way if you angle it the right way, whereas the Allies have many, many strings to their bow, and the submarine arm is one of many, many assets they bring to the table. So it didn't get the publicity then, and therefore has kind of lost a bit of people's attention today. But you've done a fantastic job redressing the balance, Iain. Good luck with all your publications. Good luck. We were talking before we went online, various projects in the works. We'll bring you back again, and with the magazine and everything else you do. And Deadly Trade has got to be up there as a classic work in terms of submarines. So thank you very much for bringing it to us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, everybody. So I'll see you again tomorrow. We're talking about Ernie Pyle tomorrow with a fantastic guest. I'm looking forward to that. Military suicides on Thursday, and then the operation of the Battle of Britain Bunker on Friday. So great more content coming your way. Please consider subscribing. Please consider becoming a member. But in the meantime, thank you for your comments and questions. I'll see you all tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.